If God is good, does he really condemn people? Is there a heaven or hell that he sends people to?
I've been told that you have to pick one or the other, science or faith.
I want to learn more about the teachings of the Bible, but sometimes when I read the lessons and the stories, they just don't make sense.
Our world is full of immense suffering and huge need. If God is all loving, why does he let people suffer? Why doesn't he cure cancer or COVID or all of those other things that people face on a regular basis?
Why do bad things happen to good people?
All right, so we're continuing our series today, A Thinking Person's Guide to Faith. And of course, we're discussing important topics every week. And today we're talking about hypocrisy, which is a heavy topic. And at the same time, I feel a little torn because wintertime is, of course, holiday time for us, but it's also birthday time in the Gear household. So my wife Hannah's birthday was this past Thursday. And then my sons played a pep rally. They play in a band together. They played a pep rally Friday morning. My little guy turns 8 tomorrow, so I'm like in party mode right now. So I'm talking about hypocrisy and A Thinking Person's Guide to Faith, but we're having a great time. Wintertime is a celebratory and very expensive time in the Gear household. Lots of gifts and celebrating, but I'm having a great time this weekend. I hope that you have some downtime this weekend. If you have some time off tomorrow, of course, for Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and the day we're going to talk about why that day is important. But I've been having a great weekend. I hope the same is true for you. We also have some exciting things coming up in the well. We have a newcomers lunch that I mentioned on February 4th. For anybody who's new in the church, it's an informal time to come together, and you can ask questions and just get to know some new people in the church. We'd love to have you if you're new. And then in my email this past Friday, I put a new announcement in there. It's extremely exciting. We're going to take a mission trip to North Baja, Mexico in late February. It's the last weekend in February. Many of you are sponsoring kids who are in foster care at Niños de Baja in the North Baja, Mexico. And this is a chance, if you'd like to go meet some of those kids. And we hope that we'll have some kind of light project like painting or something like that. But we're having an informational meeting coming up, I believe January 24th. That information's in my email. It's a Zoom meeting, and so if you're interested in going on that mission trip, it's a Friday through Monday, so you have to take 2 days off work if you're working. I'm going to go. I'm excited about it, and we'll have this informational meeting, and then go to Niños de Baja. We'll have some fun meeting the kids and play games. And then I'll be honest with you, they said like some of the best tacos you're ever going to have in your life are there. So if I'm missing from the group, you know where to find me. I'm at the taco stand, wherever that is. So I'm excited about that, and it's a great opportunity for our church. So this is the second week of our new series, A Thinking Person's Guide to Faith. And thinking people have questions about faith. Let's just start there. We're allowed to say that here, by the way. Is that okay? That we're allowed to say that here. Are you guys with me this morning? Are you guys with me? Okay. I know it's cold. It's the second week of a series, so attendance always drops on week 2 a little bit, so there's some holes in the seats. But we're all here, right? We here to have a good time this morning? Are we here to have a good time this morning? Okay. This is an extremely important topic, so we can start by saying, thinking people have questions about faith. We can actually say that. And nobody's going to kick you out the back door next to the dumpsters here if you say thinking people have questions about faith. There are a lot of churches in America where you can't say that. You can't acknowledge that simple truth. Now, some people have questions about faith that we hold on to loosely because they don't really affect our lives or their faith that much. Some questions, however, do deeply trouble us because we feel torn. We feel a sense of cognitive dissonance. There are some questions we have about faith that cause us to ask, man, let's just be honest here. Some of us ask, can I really be a Christian? Can I really believe in the kind of God that I've heard about? How do I make sense of that? Well, I want to be a good person. Sometimes I hear things that are claims that are made in churches or by people of faith that I don't know if it's even ethical. And I have questions about that. And some of those questions, they can cause deep cognitive dissonance. And so it's not just this brainy exercise about theology or what we believe, but it's something that affects us emotionally. How many of you know, here's a rhetorical question, I know the answer to this. How many of you know this can affect your relationship with your family members? Oh, yes. when you are honest about questions you have about faith, and maybe they don't appreciate your honesty. So we want to be the kind of community where thinking people who can come together and we can have a spiritual home and we can talk through these things and work through these things, and that means we're not always going to come to the same answers. I know some people come from church environments where it's okay to have questions as long as you get to the same answer eventually. Do you know what I'm talking about? But the truth is, that's not always going to happen. And that's okay. That's just kind of a part of Christian history where we're just going to have to agree to disagree sometimes. But in this series, we're acknowledging some of the most common questions that people have about faith. And I did this last week, but I think it's just good to look at the schedule every week. So last week we talked about the Bible, science, and thinking for yourself. I gave you about an hour and 15-minute info dump last week on the Bible and science. I could give a whole series on it, which I probably will sometime. But today we're talking about when Christians act hypocritically. Next week, we're talking about how to interpret the Bible. What is the Bible? How do I interpret it? Making sense of the Bible. And then on January 28th, a major question that thinking people have: does God consign people to an eternal hell? Is that what the afterlife is like? And then on February 4th, I love this title, The Strange Relationship Between Jesus and American Politics. Might be my favorite title in the whole series. And then February 11th, the Bible, sexuality, and abortion. And then on February 18th, maybe the most commonly asked question: why does God allow suffering? Now, that's an interesting way to make friends, isn't it? Talking about those topics. But again, we have to be willing to talk about them, even if we don't all agree on the answers that we give. We have to be willing to talk about them if we want to be intellectually honest, and be the kind of a church where curious, thinking people can be honest and not have to pretend. And as we're going to see today, that's very important. We don't need churches that cause more people to pretend. Can I get an amen? We don't need more hypocrite factories in the United States. So that's why we want to deal with these questions. So if this is appealing to you, I want to encourage you to invite a friend to join you in person or online for a Thinking Person's Guide to Faith. So today, why we're talking about when Christians act hypocritically. Now, religious hypocrisy causes an enormous amount of damage and inflicts an enormous amount of pain on people who see it, or even worse, people who experience mistreatment because of it. When we see hypocrisy, our response, our feelings can range from disgust, even amusement at times. We see some things, we just roll our eyes at. We're like, you can't believe somebody's doing this or saying these things. But that can also, our response can also range all the way to trauma. There are things that we see that don't really affect us directly. We see some televangelist who's obviously a grifter and a huckster, and we can't believe that people fall for this, and we roll our eyes. Or you hear some politician claim to be a person of faith, and they say something the complete opposite of what Jesus would say. You're like, oh my goodness, how do those people sleep at night? And it's disgust and kind of amusement. But then also, so many of us have experienced the kind of hypocrisy where, and this is the right word, we are traumatized by it. Religious trauma is a thing. That's not being overly dramatic. I think of abuse scandals. Maybe people who were, as a child, trusted a religious authority figure, and they were abused by that person. And you think about how deep that wound cuts that person. That is trauma in all capital letters that can take years and years and years to heal from, and they may never heal completely. Or people who, as adults, experience that kind of treatment from a religious authority member, or just somebody in the church or in their religious community who turned out to be a sexual predator, or that gossiped about them and ostracized them, or people who were essentially ostracized, kicked out of their community because of their sexuality or because of their questions that they have. Many of you, probably. And it can take years to heal from the religious trauma that we feel at the hands of people who act hypocritically. And so we have the whole range of hypocrisy today in mind, from the silly and comical all the way to the horrid and traumatic. And we want to understand, first of all today, what is hypocrisy? What is a hypocrite? What does that mean? Because it's actually an interesting word picture that we get in the New Testament. And then how to heal from the effects of hypocrisy. And then perhaps most importantly, how not to be a hypocrite. So that's where we're headed today. So first of all, and this is kind of the fun part of talking about hypocrisy, if there is such a thing. We have the word hypocrite because who used it? When you're in church, the answer is either Jesus, Bible, or prayer. So what do you think? Who used the word hypocrisy? Jesus. Hypocrisy is in the English language because Jesus used it. It's a direct translation from Greek that the New Testament was written in into English. And so here is hypocrisy or hypocrite. In Greek, that's what it looks like, by the way. I thought that might be interesting to show you there. The H is not, it's pronounced, but it's not, the letter is not there. So you kind of start with the U, and then that pi symbol there, that's a P in English, and then the O, and then the kind of that X and that R is like, you have to roll your R a little bit. And then the I is pronounced E. You see the T there. And then that looks like an N with a long leg on the right. That's pronounced A. And then you have kind of an interesting looking S there. So it's hypocrites. Would you like to try that with me on a cold Sunday morning here in Phoenix? Hypocrites. Say it with me. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Hypocrites, hypocrites. And of course, we transliterate that directly into English as hypocrite. And when you see a Greek word, a lot of times like medical terms, the U there at the beginning there, that kind of U-looking letter in the Greek, just turn that into a Y. And that's how we bring it over into English. So hypocrite, hypocrites, hypocrites, you see there Hypo. And that's hypo, right? So in English, if somebody is hypoglycemic, what does that mean? They have low blood sugar. So hypo is low or under. And if somebody's hyperactive, what does that mean? It's like high or above. So more active than usual would be hyper. So hyper is high or above. Hypo is low or under, and so this is going to be an interesting compound Greek word. We have low or under something. And then krites in Greek means to decide or to interpret. Interesting. So it's like an under-decider, an under-interpreter. That's what hypocrite literally means. That's the word picture in Greek, an under-interpreter, an interpreter from underneath. Like, what is going on there? And it's one of the clearest examples of the importance of context in the Bible. Because when we read something in the Bible, as we talked about last week, and you're going to talk about next week as well, context is what goes with the text, right? So we have the text of the Bible, but sometimes things don't quite make sense without context. The reason for that is when Jesus used this word, hypocrites, everybody around him knew what it meant. So it doesn't need to be explained. When Matthew here, we're going to read Matthew's gospel in a second, when Matthew was talking about hypocrites, he didn't need to explain what that was because everybody knew. They never thought, well, 2,000 years from now, people in America would be like, what's this mean? That thought never crossed their minds. So context helps here. An interpreter from underneath. Now, we know from Greco-Roman culture, the Greek and Roman world, exactly what a hypocrites, an interpreter from underneath, means, and it meant an actor. Somebody who's a play actor, in Greek theater. Somebody who is an actor. And why would you have an interpreter from underneath? Because Greek actors wore, help me out, masks. So Greek actors were people who were underneath the mask, and they were the interpreter, the decider. If you're into acting, plays, theater, you know that you make choices, you interpret, you decide how you're going to play that part. And so an actor is somebody who interprets from underneath the mask. I'm guessing this mask means surprise, or he's has a really limited range. What are they like? Lucius said what? And that's the expression that you get. But hypocrites is an actor, somebody who interprets from underneath a mask. And acting is a great profession and an awesome skill. This mask is actually from the 1st century BC, right before the time of Jesus. And so you can start to see why hypocrites is such an interesting word picture when it's used negatively to refer to somebody who's not an actor, but to refer to their behavior. It's somebody who acts like somebody they're not, somebody who is wearing a mask. What you see on the outside is different from what is underneath what is on the inside. Isn't that interesting? Now, I know many of you probably grew up in church, you already knew the meaning of the word hypocrite. But I just love that word picture, that a hypocrite, according to Jesus, is somebody who's acting, they're pretending. You see something on the outside, but that's not what's really on the inside. It's usually the opposite. And that's how Jesus refers to people who act like this and live like this. They're play actors, they're pretending, they're wearing a mask. Let's look at some examples here, all from Matthew. The first one is in Matthew chapter 6. This is kind of Jesus' greatest hits when it comes to calling people hypocrites. Jesus is just cooking on the mic here, just calling people out for hypocrisy. So in Matthew 6, Jesus says, when you give the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues or on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. And this is just a great spiritual concept. So then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. You see this contrast Jesus is painting between the outward appearance, the outward look, and what's happening inside. Then we'll go to Matthew chapter 23. This is a part of what's called the woe passages, some of the harshest words of Jesus we have. We have Matthew and the Gospel of Matthew. These are pretty harsh pronouncements coming out of Jesus' mouth. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert. And when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. Wow. Now, let's be honest. You ever see some religious people or political figures and you think, maybe that applies? Yeah. And how about Matthew chapter 23, verses 25 through 28? Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they're full of greed and self-indulgence. He's calling out the religious leaders and the government leaders of his time. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. That's about as clear as you can get. So that's Jesus painting a picture of what it looks like to be a hypocrite. It looks different on the outside than on the inside. It's a person who wears a mask, who intentionally is engaged in image management. And they want other people to see on the outside something that is different from who they are on the inside. And Matthew has this conflict with small Jewish communities at this time. And so some of this makes us uncomfortable. At this time, there were Christians and Jews were persecuted by the Roman Empire. Both were small religious sects. They never imagined how the treatment of Jews would progress throughout history to the Holocaust. Right? So these words can make us uncomfortable, but they reflect conflict between the early Christian communities and the early Jewish communities. But when I read these words, I don't know if you are thinking this, but as I read these words, I'm thinking of lots of Christians in America today, where I just feel like the script has been flipped, and there are so many people who call themselves Christians, but Jesus would easily say words like this to them, and I hope not to me. But I think there are a lot of Christians in America who this applies to. So when we think about hypocrisy and what it means and how we have suffered at the hands of hypocritical people and how we react when we see Christians acting hypocritically and the damage that it does, how do we heal from the treatment that we receive from people who are acting hypocritically? And the truth is, even if we laugh or if it's just disgusting to us, that still affects us negatively. And then you have that range of all the way to religious trauma. How do we heal when people act hypocritically towards us? So when I was 19, I was a part of a brand new church in my hometown back in Ohio. And I helped the pastor start a brand new church. He came back from seminary. And he was 30 years old, and I looked up to him because he was so old and experienced. I'm like, 30 years old? Wow. Like, how does he get out of bed in the morning? Like, how do you even function when you're that old, when you're 30 years old? And I looked up to him. He was my hero. And I was 19, and I was his right-hand man. I literally hung out with him almost every day for over a year, starting this new congregation from scratch. And there was so much that I admired about him. I learned a great deal from him. He did a great job in lots of ways. But it also didn't take long for me to feel like he wasn't treating me as a normal person would. He was manipulative. He was domineering. He was harsh at times. And I started to realize, wait, something's a little off. You know, he's a pastor. He has good intentions. He does a lot of good things. He gives hope to a lot of people, but there's some things that are a little off. And as I got to know him, he would share at times, and his story was that he moved from house to house when he was a child. His mother, I think, if I remember right, had drug issues. His father was absent. He was raised by his grandparents, and so was I, partly, but he just had a difficult experience. He was in and out of trouble as a teenager. He missed a lot of school, had, kind of the wrong crowd, and I could see how, okay, I think the behavior that I'm seeing from him and what I know about his story, like he didn't receive a whole lot of empathy as a kid. He didn't get a whole lot of support. He kind of had to live on the streets in a sense. And so I kind of get where his behavior comes from. And then I left that church. I went off to college. And a couple of years later, there was a female worship leader in the congregation. And she had experienced some abuse as a child, and he offered to give her pastoral counseling. And in the course of that pastoral counseling, and this is all coming from her later, he suggested that it would be healing for her if they reenacted the abuse there in the church office. And she was smart enough and wise enough that she got out of there and she let it be known what had happened, and he was removed from his position. And when I heard that, I mean, obviously I was cut to the heart by it, greatly disturbed by it. I knew her as well, that she had gone through something like that. And at the same time, and I'm just coming from my experience, I was never tempted to blame God. Like, God, how could you let a guy like this be a pastor? How could you let things happen like this, God? Because I could see who he was and his background, and that would never in a million years excuse his behavior, because what he did was wrong enough that he was rightly removed immediately, and that hypocrisy hurt a lot of people. And at the same time, I felt like I was able to know him enough that I could pull back the curtain of his life, and I understood why people are like that, why people who act like that do so. Some people act selfishly to protect their resources. Some people are just dishonest because they don't have a conscience. Some people are afraid, so they live a lie to avoid what they fear, rejection, or they're afraid that people will find them out. Some people lack self-reflection, so they're blind to their own hypocrisy. Some people are so wounded that they act only in the way they know. And I saw this guy and I thought, you know what? This guy was so wounded that this is what comes out of his life. And he was removed as he should have been, and it was victimizing to her, and she had to go through real counseling and heal from that. But I was able to see this is why people do this. You know, when you hear these crazy pastor scandals or televangelist scandals, this is why people do this. This is how this happens. It's the real, just complex, ugly reality of the way that some people grow up, or quite frankly, the mental and emotional issues that some people have. When I hear about some scandal, when I see ridiculous, hypocritical behavior that's horrible, that should be, they should be removed from their positions. So if it's legal, there are going to be criminal consequences. I'm also, I guess at this point, able to see a lot of hypocrisy is rooted in poor mental and emotional health. People who lie and have no conscience, I mean, that's a diagnosis. That's part of antisocial personality disorder. People who are incarcerated, a lot of times, there are people who could be diagnosed with that. They don't have the same conscience that a normal person has. They don't feel the same level of empathy that a normal person has. Does that excuse their behavior? Not in any way whatsoever, no. It's just when it comes to how it affects me, how does their hypocrisy affect me? I see a lot of times, gosh, I mean, it's insecurity, it's fear of rejection, it's some kind of cluster B personality trait. It's somebody who was kicked around as a child. And so, you see a pastor who was moved from, home to home and is clearly mentally ill. Well, I'm surprised but not shocked that something like that would happen. And I'm speaking out of my own experience here when it comes to healing from hypocrisy. What he did was not God's fault. I'm speaking from my own experience. Certainly not the victim's fault. It wasn't her fault. It was the brokenness of somebody who grew up in this world, having a difficult experience, and acts hypocritically because that's what comes out of that kind of brokenness. And in my own experience, I learned to separate God from people who use God's name. That this is the messiness of humanity. And there are people who I don't want to. When I say that, I don't want to like shame people who did leave religious communities because of behavior like that. But I guess I knew him, and I knew his story, and I thought, that's why people act like this. And so it helped me to heal from that hypocrisy, to see he's a broken human being. And I think that's true in all of these cases. Tomorrow is a federal holiday in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. And a couple of years ago, in my day job, we had a discussion on my team about King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And it's the famous letter he wrote when he was arrested in April of 1963 in a nonviolent protest against segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. And in my day job, then I had a young black coworker at the time who has become a friend, and he pointed out a particular part of Dr. King's letter that he thought was the most important, that he wished more people read and heard. And he's like, this is the part of the letter that I wish everybody knew. And I'm going to read that part of the letter here in a moment. But you think about the hypocrisy that Martin Luther King Jr. experienced. And of course, we know he engaged in nonviolent protests, but that nonviolent protest was almost always met with violence. Fire hoses or dogs or batons. And you think of the hypocrisy of people who claim that, they're Christians and they love Jesus, but they were okay with the kind of treatment that the black community experienced all over this country, and certainly in the segregated South. And then when King was arrested in Birmingham in 1963, there were 8 white religious leaders in the South who issued a public statement on Dr. King expressing, quote unquote, concern about his activities and urging caution. Now, by the way, this is a pro tip if you haven't been around church long enough to know, when a religious person says they have concerns about you, that means they would burn you at the stake if it were still legal. If you don't know that yet, that's what that means when people say concerns. They would use some medieval torture device to, kill you for heresy, but if it weren't 2024. So now that they can't burn you at the stake, they just invite you out for coffee. That's how that works in church. I have concerns. I'm wondering if we could go grab some coffee. That means that's the equivalent of a medieval torture device by 2024 standards. So I have some concerns. And so these 8 religious leaders had concerns about Dr. King's activities. And he wrote a letter from a Birmingham jail to these religious leaders, and of course everybody else like them, addressing their concerns. Now this first part won't be on the screen, but this is the intro to the letter, and I'm going to get to the part that my friend said he wished more people knew. So here's how King began, letter from a Birmingham jail. While confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling our present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom, if ever, do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms across my desk, my secretaries would be engaged in little else in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I would like to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. And in the paragraphs that followed, King stated that he was in Birmingham because he was invited to address injustices there. And he pointed out that these religious leaders were concerned about the demonstrations he led, but not about the injustices that led to the demonstrations. This past week, a senator from Texas wanted to introduce legislation to make it more difficult to protest. This is still going on. And he wrote in the letter that he reminded them that his protests were nonviolent, that he was not engaged in violence. And if there were any laws broken, like traffic being disrupted, he pointed out that there are man-made laws and that there is a higher law. There is God's law. And then comes the paragraph that my friend thought that it was most important, that he wished that more Americans were aware of what King says in this paragraph. And this will be on the screen. King wrote, I must make 2 honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the last few years, and here's the phrase that my young black friend wished more people knew. Over the last few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Whew. Isn't that good? And King there is calling out the hypocrisy of the white moderate, people who coolly state from a position of privilege, removed from the pain of injustice, well, I agree with what you're doing. I just wish you would wait a little longer. I wish you would just do it differently. Slow down, wait, just simmer down now. And then they defend the status quo while acting, moderate and calm. And you think about the pain that hypocrisy caused, King, and others in the civil rights movement, and everybody who would have benefited from the civil rights movement. How do we heal from hypocrisy? You think about the pain that comes from that kind of hypocrisy. One of the ways is you remember the hypocrisy that other people have faced. That we're not the only ones who have felt the pain of hypocrisy. As a matter of fact, it's something that's been going on throughout all human history. And our pain is very real, but we're not alone in our pain. In spite of the gross hypocrisy that he faced, Martin Luther King Jr. marched on and eventually changed his country for the better and became a model of freedom around the world. So how do we heal from hypocrisy? Well, perhaps one of the ways is we pull back the curtain and we see that human beings are messy and complex. And if we understand a person's life, it might actually make sense to us why they do what they do. For some of us, that's hard because we think that in some way excuses what they do or removes consequences. Not in any way. No. A person who acts hypocritically and does something horrible, they should pay for that, of course. There should be justice for that. If it's criminal, they go to prison. It doesn't remove consequences. It doesn't excuse it in any way. But it's not really about them anymore. It's about us. How are we going to heal? How do we move on? Well, one of the ways, you pull back the curtain and you understand. Humans are complex. And people who act hypocritically do so often for diagnosable reasons. And then we remember the hypocrisy that other people have faced throughout history. And we know that we're not alone. And we know how to move forward. And we know hypocrisy when we see it. We know how to call it out. We know how to avoid it. Now, it's only mid-January, but in 2024, the United States is already getting weird. Am I right? I think we can already tell, okay, it's just going to get stranger and stranger, where the news headlines that we see would not have been imagined in this country a generation ago. We haven't seen this before, at least not in 150 years. Well, our public life is a masterclass in hypocrisy. And the other day, our family was driving down Val Vista Road, which is right out here, and right out there actually. And they're building new homes on what was a cattle farm a couple of years ago, and the development name is up on the sign. And my 13-year-old saw the name on the development sign, and it was a water-themed name, water something. And around here in the Sonoran Desert, a lot of housing developments have water-based names. And so he read the name on this sign, and he's like, oh, it was like Waterson or something like that. And he's like, I wonder why they call it Waterson. And I said, well, why do you think that is, bud? And he's like, well, because there's no water around here, I guess. I don't know. And I said, well, that's called marketing. That's called branding. And lots of developments around here are named after water in some way. And I said, you're right. Why are they named after water? Because there isn't any. There's a lot of beach, but no ocean around here. And that's marketing. It puts a picture in people's minds of something that maybe they wished was there, and sometimes there are man-made, lakes or canals or whatever that are, and it's marketing. It's meant to put an idea in somebody's mind. But because being the kind of dad I am, I launched into a dad speech with no provocation about other ways that we see this in the United States. And I said, buddy, it's important to learn this lesson, that there's a difference between words and actions, and between branding and reality. And I said, every single day around here, I see a bumper sticker about how patriotic somebody is, or about how much they love the Constitution. Or you'll see trucks with numerous flags flying, flapping in the wind. And I said, buddy, if somebody is a patriotic American, they don't have to tell you. Why? Because you'll see it in their actions. When somebody's a patriotic American, they love America enough to make it better. They want to make it a more perfect union. They respect the outcome. They respect the Constitution. They follow the law. You can tell they're patriotic by their actions. So I said, bud, when people are constantly telling everybody how patriotic they are, why do you think that is? Well, they have to say They're patriotic with words because their actions show the opposite of that. It's like they're wearing a mask. And let me just ask you all here, if you have a little bit of life experience, when words and actions don't match, which one do you believe? Oh, this is the congregation participation moment in the sermon, everybody. When words and actions don't match, which one do you believe? Yeah. You have any relationship difficulties where you're confused? I'm not sure how this person feels about me. If words and actions don't match, which one do you believe? If somebody calls themselves a patriot, but they're trying to subvert the government, which one do you believe? Actions. And so I said, buddy, people will talk about things that are often the opposite of what their actions show you, and they talk about it on purpose. It's a mask. They're acting in a way that is hypocritical. Hypocrites. And so even, for King, he saw this behavior and he saw these white, moderate, genteel, upstanding Christians, and he saw this hypocrisy. But yet, he went forward. He marched forward. So healing looks like seeing the frailty in other people that is often behind hypocritical actions, or a lack of conscience even, or the grossness of selfishness, as Jesus talked about, corruption and greed and self-indulgence that comes out of their fear. Right? But still recognizing that, deciding you're not going to hate that person, you're going to put one foot in front of the other, and you're going to march onward, doing what you know is right. And finally, I'll wrap it up with this. Let's be honest. Everybody loves talking about hypocrites as long as it's about somebody else. We don't like talking about hypocrisy when it might be us. We're hesitant to turn the spotlight onto ourselves and examine whether or not we are acting hypocritically in any way. Now, this is the super unpopular part of the sermon. If we're hesitant or unwilling to ask if we might be acting hypocritically, guess what? We probably are. That's one of the things that leads to hypocrisy. A lack of self-reflection, an unwillingness to look inward, an unwillingness to self-examine. People who are afraid, maybe out of our own woundedness, even say, oh no, I'm a victim of hypocrisy. I would never do that to anybody else. But then sometimes somebody else who experiences this, they might see something different. Maybe out of our woundedness, we act in a way that other people think is hypocritical. There's a saying, if you don't heal from what wounded you, you'll bleed on people who didn't cut you. And so even out of our own woundedness, sometimes we can act in hypocritical ways. Are there ways that I have acted hypocritically in my life? There are. Unfortunately, I don't have any big news to break. We don't need to call the local news. I don't have anything like that. But are there times that I've acted in a way that didn't show the perfect love of God? That didn't show the exact image of Jesus in my life? You better believe it. Yeah. And I suppose there are people who could look at me and, man, that guy's a hypocrite. I hope not. But to avoid that, I need to be willing to ask this all-important question. Is there any area of my life where I am acting hypocritically? Is there any area, I believe I have it on the screen here. If not, I just walked over here very dramatically to reveal that. Is there any area of my life where I am acting hypocritically? If I'm not willing to ask that question, folks, we all need to hear this together and agree on something this morning. If I'm not willing to ask that question of myself, guess what? I'm perpetuating the problem. If I'm not willing to self-examine and have the courage to be honest and take steps to address whatever is going on in my life that might lead to behavior that people would perceive as hypocritical, then I am going to perpetuate that. So you and I want to be committed to living like this and asking this question, what would it look like to not be a hypocrite and to live like that? I say I'm a follower of Jesus. What would it look like to not be a hypocrite? To not be another hypocritical Christian and live like that? To be an anti-hypocrite What would it look like to live like that? Well, it involves overcoming the pain that hypocrisy has caused us, to see why people act in that way, and to put one foot in front of the other. And when we do that, the hypocrisy doesn't win. The people who were acting hypocritically, they don't win. When we put one foot in front of the other and we see it for what it is, love wins. In the way of Jesus wins, and the mask can come off, and we can be authentic, and we can see the amazing outcome when we're willing to ask that question and press on and do the right thing. And I'll close with this. The achievement of Martin Luther King Jr. really was, the big achievement was inspiring humanity to recognize human rights here in the United States and around the world. But the legislative achievement was the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. His work led up to that. Without his work, that would not have happened. So King wrote an article in 1963 after the March on Washington, where the I Have a Dream speech changed the minds and hearts of millions of people. And he wrote, "The hundreds of thousands who marched in Washington marched to level barriers. They summed up everything in a word, now." What is the content of now? Everything, not some things, in the president's civil rights bill is a part of now. So the March on Washington, all these nonviolent protests, what are we leading up to here? We're leading for change to happen, for the law to be changed. And so after the assassination of Kennedy in November of '63, King continued to press for the civil rights bill with the new president, Lyndon Johnson. And in January of 1964, King maintained that legislation was the order of the day. At the Great March on Washington last summer, the Negro and his compatriots for self-respect and human dignity will not be denied. I'm not going to let the hypocrisy I've experienced stop me. I'm not going to wallow in despair, as he put it, but I'm going to press on. The Civil Rights Bill passed the House of Representatives in February of 1964, but it stalled in the Senate due to a filibuster by Southern senators that lasted 75 days. A 75-day filibuster by some Southern senators. Finally, after 75 days, the bill passed the Senate. And King said that it would bring practical relief to the Negro in the South and will give the Negro in the North a psychological boost that he sorely needs. And on July 2nd, 1964, LBJ signed the new Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law, with King and other civil rights leaders present. And the law's provisions created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to address race and sex discrimination in employment, and a community relations service to help local communities solve racial disputes. It authorized federal intervention to ensure the desegregation of schools, parks, swimming pools, and other public facilities, and restricted the use of literacy tests as a requirement for voter registration and all the voter suppression games. And you imagine the work and the pain that went into King's work and the leaders in the civil rights movement, protesting really the nation's hypocrisy, and how vindicating and healing it must have been for Martin Luther King Jr. when that bill was finally signed into law. Religious hypocrisy is a reality for anybody in a church, no matter what kind of church it is. Hypocrisy in general is a reality of the human experience, whether it's religious or not. There are many people or reasons that people act hypocritically, and there are people who are traumatized by it. And as King wrote in the article, now we're faced with a choice of what we're going to do about that. How are we going to respond to hypocritical treatment? Do we seek healing? Do we pull back the curtain? Okay, I understand why people do the things they do. It doesn't excuse it in any way. It doesn't eliminate the consequences. But it frees me from hating them. I can see, okay, this is why people act the way they do. And then I can remember I'm not the only person who has experienced hypocrisy. Other people have experienced horrible hypocrisy in many ways. And people like King and others, they decided, you know what, I'm not going to let this hypocrisy win. I'm going to keep putting one foot in front of the other. I'm going to march forward in healing and and towards what is good. And as we heal from hypocrisy, we change the way things are. We're willing to look inside, and we're willing to prevent ourselves from acting hypocritically. And we can, as the saying goes, we can be the change that we want to see in the world. I invite you to pray with me. Oh God, we thank you for the example of King and so many others who, in the face of gross hypocrisy, responded even with compassion, even with a dignified letter, like letter from a Birmingham jail, that these religious leaders didn't really deserve, but he wrote that to lay out the case, that the hypocrisy can't win. And he continued to put one foot in front of the other, marching towards changing the hearts of a nation and changing the hearts of many around the world, but also towards changing the law. So God, we remember, as we feel the pain of hypocrisy, that there are reasons why people act the way they act, and we're not alone. We're not the only people who have experienced hypocritical treatment. And like so many others, we can choose to not let the hypocrisy win, and we can put one foot in front of the other and keep on marching toward the right thing. And as we do that, we have to remember the all-important work. We don't want to become the thing that we have suffered at. We don't suffered from. We don't want to act hypocritically in any way. We want to be willing to look inward and ask, is there any way that I'm acting hypocritically? Is there anything in my life that would cause somebody to look at me and say, oh, look, that person is acting hypocritically? If we're not willing to look inward, we can just about bet we'll perpetuate that. And so, God, we want to be the change that we want to see. And we thank you that you love us, that you give us compassion, you give us grace, you give us forgiveness. That's why we offer it to other people. We need it. And because we're motivated, God, by your love for us and your acceptance for us, we know we can have the courage to be honest. And we can continue to grow and keep on putting one foot in front of the other and marching towards the right thing. In Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen.